All right, so what is this about? I've been working with organizations for, well, 25, 30 years, and I was always surprised that organizations don't deliver on what they promise. They don't always provide the good products in time. They don't make their people happy. They act very slowly, and all the issues which we have seen in organizations have aggravated over the last 10, 20 years. And now it is very obvious. So I would like to talk about what's the principles of a 20th century company, and what should be the principles of a 21st century, and how can we actually change that? And the interesting thing is, I talked about Charlie Feldgate, who opened the first Lighthouse some days ago, and he talked about strategy. And the interesting question is, because strategy was such a holy cow for such a long time, and there were whole departments and organizations just dealing with strategy. And we all know that it didn't last for long. There weren't really strategies, particularly in the last 10, 20 years, which lasted for longer than the ink on the paper was dry. So what strategy are we actually talking about? And do organizations need a strategy? Charlie Feldgate said a very remarkable sentence. He said, there are more and more blurred lines between strategy and vision. There are more and more blurred lines between strategy and vision. Isn't that interesting? Because usually you kept the two things apart. I mean, there was the department which worked on the vision, very often HR or change management or so on. And then there were the strategic thinkers who said, okay, we have to implement this and that, and we have to make plans and things like that. And the two things never went together. And this is why it was so difficult to understand actually where organizations wanted to go. Now, there is something which I found already some years ago, and this is really, really interesting. I just went back to their website to check whether it's still true. There is a company which is called SoftBank. And this guy, his name is Masayoshi Son, had a very crazy idea already, I think 8 or 9 years ago, and you can still find it on the website of SoftBank. SoftBank is a technology company. They started with wireless, and they're providing all kinds of technology services. So what you can read on the website is the following: to continue to grow as a corporate group for the next 300 years, the SoftBank Group strives to develop over the long term by forming partnerships with the most superior companies at the time in the information industry without adhering to particular technology or business models. The SoftBank Group aimed to contribute to people's happiness through the information revolution and to become the corporate group needed most by people around the world. To achieve its vision, SoftBank will continue to concentrate its operations in the information industry and advance the information revolution. So think about that for a moment. And Tanja, sorry, you're not muted. I heard some strange voice from there. Okay. So a 300 years vision, how is that possible? Strange. Tanja, what's your, now I wanted to ask you to unmute you. What's your idea about a company, about that crazy idea of establishing a 300 years vision?
I thought it was an interesting selection you made to put here in the presentation, because I can't imagine how anyone can have a 300-year vision without knowing the environment that they're working in, unless they're embracing certain concepts of adapting with the environment. That's the only thought that came to my mind. And then I question how do they embrace that? What does that actually look like?
Yeah. Yes, and the idea to have one through-going idea which brings all people together, and no matter what they do, no matter what they do in business, there is a line which defines any kind of strategy. So, talking black black swans, and probably you all know the book of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Black Swan, which I don't know was published more than 10 years ago, and I found it very fascinating. And of course, there's a lot of debates about the concept, but I think there is some truth in it. So what are black swans? For those of you who haven't read the book, the idea is that before Europeans came to Australia, swans were white. Nobody knew black swans. So there wasn't the idea that there could be black swans, but then suddenly this black swan was discovered. So what Nassim Taleb describes is that there are events from time to time which are so unprecedented that nobody counts on them. And then suddenly they impose a big challenge to companies and to societies and to individuals. So the main characteristics of black swan events is, first of all, they are beyond the realm of normal expectations. They are non-computable, so they're really in the area of high complexity or even chaos. And there are psychological biases, so people can't see them. People are blinded. They can't really see that something is coming up. And I'll give you some examples for that, because if we look at 20th century's organizations, this is really where they failed. Or where we saw that the usual setup of companies and the way they build their strategies and the way they build up their departments and things like that didn't really work in that situation. So I just want to give you 3 examples which were very decisive for my life, which influenced my life very much. So the first one was Chernobyl. And I read a very interesting book earlier this year, which is called Midnight in Chernobyl. So this is the story about the world's greatest nuclear disaster. And it's very interesting. It became very, very clear. Chernobyl, at least in its consequences, in the big tragedy which happened to the people around, was basically due to a very, very strict hierarchy which nobody could circumvent. There was a very clear line of command. People did mistakes, people made orders. It took a long time to pass down the orders along the chain of command. And actually, what I didn't know, this thing happened within a few seconds. I think less than a minute or so. The whole explosion happened in a very, very short time. So the people saw it coming and then it was already too late, but they made mistakes before and they made a lot of mistakes later on. So that's Black Swan number 1. Black Swan number 2 for me was obviously 9/11. I think nobody would ever have thought that Islamic terrorists would send airplanes into the World Trade Center. Nobody would have. And what happened afterwards was, and another interesting book, which I read already 2-3 years ago, is Team of Teams, which describes that the American military was absolutely incapable in the years to come to deal with this threat and to deal with this highly decentralized organizations of Al-Qaeda. The third one, obviously we are just seeing, and this is so interesting because, I mean, there are still people who are blinded. There are still people who are denying that COVID-19 actually is happening. And it took a long time. And it was very difficult for companies, but also for governments, and particularly for governments to find the right reaction. So what does that show us? That shows us the 20th century organization principles. And they have a long tradition. So number 1 is obviously Frederick Taylor, who is probably the founder of modern industrial process work. Frederick Taylor made his scientific management, all the measurements, and he could exactly explain what you have to do in order to get a product and how to make it as efficient as possible. And that had an impact on the way we worked from the beginning of the 20th century until now. And it's still in many companies, it's still working that way. Number 2 was Henry Gantt, the inventor of the Gantt chart, which is basically the origin of project management. So Henry Gantt developed this incredible way of organizing projects in a flexible way, which still is used in a way of linear planning. And the last one, and for me, actually, this is the most important of the 3, is Alfred Sloan. I don't know whether you know actually Alfred Sloan. Some of you might and some of you might not. Alfred Sloan was the CEO of General Motors. And Alfred Sloan invented something which we will find in nearly all organizations, or let's say in more than 90% of organizations. He invented the functional organizations, the department organizations that look like that. So he broke the whole work which needs to be done in an organization into different areas, into personnel, into marketing, into sales, and what have you. And this was so successful not only in capitalist organizations, but this was also very successful in the socialist society. And it's very successful, well, it seemed to be very successful in the public sphere. So most public organizations, most administrations are organized like that. And we know it doesn't work anymore because the chain of command is too slow and it brings people into a situation where they're waiting for orders. Tanja, anything at that point you want to say about these 20th century
principles? Well, I'd actually love to hear what any of the change makers on the call have to say. Does anyone, there's been some thoughts going on in the chat box, but, and Ailish loves Frederick Taylor. I know Ailish well, so I can say that. But are there any other thoughts that anyone would like to add to the chat box at this time?
Yeah, or please, we are not so many, please unmute you. And
exactly, yes, please. Let's just have a conversation around it. Julia, you actually brought up an example in the Ukraine. I only caught it out of the corner of my eye.
Yeah, from Ukraine, you need to understand that this is something that we were growing with, and the problem was about hushing the decisions and not letting the public know, and bringing all the people to the parade for the 1st May, and all the kids who were marching under this rain in Kiev. That was incredibly, how to say, irresponsible. That would be the lightest word, but this is something that we grew with every day, every year. The 26th of April, we celebrate the stupidity of the authoritarian decision making and of bringing their reputation instead of thousands of people. So this is something very 20th century like, and let it die. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Anything else you see in the chat, Tanja, which we should highlight, or anybody else who would like to make a remark?
Yes. Delphi, would you like to just unmute yourself for a moment? Your comment about your potential career and your change of direction is also, it really is difficult to imagine being in the situation that you describe here.
Well, compared to Julia, I think my experience is much less impacted, but I was about to graduate in nuclear engineering when Chernobyl happened. So I spent a few months later, so from April 86, maybe for the rest of the year, in measuring emissions, radiations from food and water and ground and soil. And then I decided to divert my career to a different thing, because the year later, 1 year later, in Italy, there was a referendum banning the nuclear power generation. So since then, we have no nuclear power generation allowed in this country. And that is the major impact that we had for the, let's say, the source of energy in our country.
Thank you. That's, yes, both topics there directly related to Chernobyl. Is anyone else got any other comments in general? Our topic is being stuck in our organization stuck in the 20th century. And we are going to be trying to reduce this and narrow it down to a somewhat personal level. But just before we move on there, any last comments before we move on?
I was going to come in, but I was afraid to come in.
Come on, Ailish, speak up. Lovely. It's
I was
lovely.
afraid to come in. It's so long ago that I studied Taylor and all that whole thing of scientific management, and how, you know, Henry Ford's production line and the whole thing of, if you want a car, make sure it's a black one and all of that. and the whole thing of mass production and rewarding workers for a job well done. I just used to know it by heart because I did exams in it all. But I had a lot of respect for Frederick Taylor for everything that he did. He started to recognize, you know, it's not just a factory. There are actually people here. You know, he was the start of all of that, you know, and there's just so many of them. I'm even trying to think of the names where, you know, the bricklayers, and they were doing the tasks, and maybe it took 20 moves to build a wall, and they narrowed it down to 5. And it was all about improving productivity and, you know, doing more in less time. It's just so interesting, isn't it, how it's all evolved?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of the other fellow who did the bricks, but I can't think of his name. It's like Itzberg or something Berg.
Yeah.
The Hawthorne studies is another very famous study of people working on GEC Electric and the lights, and they financed a study with the workers, and the workers they knew they were being financed for this task, and so they started to produce much better. Anyway, at the end, upshot of it all was they reduced the lights and they still did really well. So they kind of buried that study. But what happened was the attention that they gave the workers was what was making them work. It was actually that the spotlight was on them. That's when they first kind of started to notice that. The Hawthorne studies is very, very famous, you know.
Thank you.
That's great. Would you like to drop that into the chat box, Ailish, for those who are interested? Then we can put just... As much as you could, just the name of the study, that would be great.
Okay.
But Holger, back over to you now.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I mean, I want to reiterate my point. All these 3 persons really brought industry and organizations forward. All 3 had very, very important contributions to the industrial development of the last 100 years. The only thing what I'm asking myself is, of course, is that still appropriate? Is that still helping in a world which is changing fastly, in a world where we have more and more of these black swan events, and where people are longing for a different kind of work, and where obviously digitization changes everything every moment? So will organizations change, and have organizations have to change? I think so. And certainly some of the principles and some of the advances that we made, or that organizations made in the last century, will prevail, but others will certainly have to be put into the trash bin. So what are 21st century principles? I thought about it a little bit, and I think it's mainly 3. Of course, you can argue about it, but I think it's 3 core principles which I think organizations have to adopt. The first one is agility. And of course, I know a lot of you are now kind of rolling your eyes because agility was such a fashion over the last year, and in the way of agile management, it didn't work in many instances. But when I'm talking about agility, I'm not talking necessarily about Scrum and Kanban and so on, although they are really, really great tools and great principles, particularly in Kanban, I like a lot. But with agility, I mean the ability of an organization to act fast. So I think this is the first 21st century principle, which again is something that calls us to think about how is strategy and vision aligned with each other, and how do we plan in the future? How can we still have an eye on what we want to achieve? And again, I'm not only talking about companies, I'm talking about public administrations. So what do we want to achieve, and how can we remain flexible? How can we quickly shift our focus? The second one is transparency. And whenever I go into a true agile company, the first thing I ask the CEO is, what do you think is the most important thing about agile, about agility? And they always tell me transparency. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by transparency. But obviously, no hidden agendas, and the openness to disclose information to everybody. and much more. I'll come to it in a moment. And the third one, and I really, this is really at my heart when I work with organizations, is accountability. And with accountability, I mean taking responsibility for making things happen. And so far, accountability was connected with a certain position in the company. And it's quite interesting. I'm working with an international NGO in the moment, and we're working a lot about accountability. And the director of the organizations understands that very well. And then we have discussions like, for example, for the financial manager, who I think, and the director thinks, he is accountable for all the financial matters. And then he says, no, I'm not accountable because the final signature is given by the director. So this understanding of accountability, which is, okay, it's a job I have to do, or I have to take care for that's being done. And this is very difficult in a traditional organization. That's very difficult in this kind of organization, which I showed before with the organizational chart, because why should I assume accountability if I'm just a wheel, a little cog wheel somewhere? If I'm just a little part in the organizations, other people are making the decisions anyhow, and I'm not going to be paid for what I actually I'm having to do. So why should I assume accountability for a company which I don't own? Now, and I'm slowly coming to my end, Tanja, and then we go over to more discussions. I've been following for the last years the conversation about what needs to change first, structure or mindset. And there are truly two different camps. There's a camp which says we have to change structures. Don't bother about mindsets, they will come. We have to change structures. We have to demolish the old structures. We have to demolish walls. We have to put up agile teams and things like that, and then the mindset will follow. There are other people who say we have to change the mindsets. Structures don't matter, and I've talked to people in organizations who are working on changing the mindsets of people, making them more accountable and things like that. But of course, we always know the empire strikes back. We always know if you haven't demolished the structures, it's very difficult to keep up with a different mindset. And I've been just talking to a person today who's working in an organization where the CEO is very much forward-looking, and he really wants to establish a modern organization, but there's a strong resistance from the ranks. And we have seen that wherever systems like holacracy or sociocracy were tried to be implemented. So, is that a hack or an hack? Is that a hen or egg question? What needs to change both? I think both need to change. And I think this is more or less my last slide, because the challenge is we have to do it at the same time. With regards to agility, we have to establish new structures which will help to quickly break down organizational units and form new ones. Structure of traditional hierarchies, very, very short pathways to decisions, no new decision processes. But at the same time, the people in the organization, that does not only concern the managers, that concerns everybody, have to be willing to learn and to adapt. They have to be ready to sacrifice their own projects because of the greater good, because of the team. They have to have a growth mindset. And we know it sounds great, but we all have our purposes, we have our concerns, we have other things in our mind, and we don't always want to change every day. Transparency. For the organization, no hidden agendas. Feedback loops, feed forward circles, and of course, open access to all company data, at least to people within. Yeah, what does it mean to the mindset again of people? The readiness to be challenged, and I see that as a real difficult point. I mean, if I look at our own team, we're struggling with it because, of course, do you want to receive feedback all the time? Do you want to be criticized? In theory, yes. But what happens if you are criticized? You go back into your shell, you have your amygdala reactions, and you don't react as you would like to react. So owning your shit and being clear that you screwed up and being ready to receive feedback is very important. And not talking behind other people's back. And the last one is accountability. And I said that already. First of all, of course, you need lean structures where delegation of decision is possible. Also new pay. People need to be paid adequately if they are accountable and probably linked to the company's success in a way. And of course, on the mindset is the entrepreneurial mindset thing, loyalty to the company, a real readiness to step up and to do things, and a systemic worldview. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Over to you, Tanja.
Okay, Holger, would you like to just stop sharing for a moment?
Absolutely.
Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to bring up? As we mentioned, we're so few here on the call. Please do feel free to simply unmute and speak up if there's anything you'd like to add at this point, just before we go on into a breakout room. Charlotte?
Yeah, I'm just about this term. I'd like to double click on this term transparency. There's so many different interpretations of transparency. And one that had caught my eye, and I've seen it in various places, is this radical transparency. What does that mean? Does anybody have an idea? Radical transparency, okay, in all its different convolutions and interpretations, what is radical transparency? Can somebody help me out there?
Anyone feel able to step up and answer that?
I mean, I can guess, but you know, I mean, there's obviously transparency around which makes people feel like they are being judged equally. So, for example, in a lot of change processes for HR and that kind of thing, there's a need to be transparent in the process so that everybody feels that they are being treated fairly. But I've heard some amazing stories of transparency through, I think it was Salesforce actually broadcasts their strategy meetings to everyone worldwide as they're happening, and so you hear all of the conversations between the executives. I think that's pretty radical, but I don't know if that's what you're meaning or what you're reading. But yeah.
Ute just mentioned in the chat, radical transparency can be scary. And yeah, that resonates. Transparency, you know, let me reflect on that, let it sink in. And if you're talking to me about radical transparency, what is it exactly that you mean? What is it? It's maybe it's just the terminology. Maybe it's just the choice of words. So
I find that interesting. I find that very interesting, that conversation, because where do you put the bar? Where do you put the limit to transparency? Yeah, can you say, okay, this far we want to be transparent, but not this part? Yeah, this is what I'm referring to. I mean, obviously, there are areas where you want to be careful with transparency, and then how do you go about that? Any other ideas from anybody else?
I know you wanted to bring up a point anyway. You just indicated just before Charlotte spoke.
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah. Well, I was actually just going to make a comment that what was the comment going to be? It was around the organisations are the way they are because it works for the people who are in them. So in terms of, for example, transparency, what is the organisation or the manager or whatever getting from not being transparent? Or what are they getting from doing something in a particular way? It's like, you know, I mean, everybody wants to get fit. probably isolation hasn't helped, but in the normal circumstances, to get fit, you can go for a walk every day and you can exercise, but people don't, even though they know what it is. So what are they getting from not doing it? And I think if we transpose that into organizations, what do organizations get from not being transparent? Well, what they get is power. Like, it's very powerful to have the information. And it's, although people can say they want to be transparent, are they willing to give up the power of having that, having been one of the only few people to have the information? So that's my 2 cents.
There are 2 interesting comments, Tanja. Maybe we want to go to them before we then send people into breakout groups. The one comes from Eliza Conti, who asks where organizations' mindset can be really integrated with human behavior and feeling. And I think this is the real challenge, because humans are humans, yeah. And in the moment you implement these principles, that's why I made this 2 columns. When you implement these principles, you really are in trouble. This is the other one, and I would like to open quickly to Erica, who made an interesting comment. Erica, can you quickly say something about what you have written?
Yes, I was just summarizing, and I'm not deeply familiar with the book, but Ray Dalio is one who, with his tremendous success as CEO of Bridgewater in the hedge fund market, it's basically just describing what you all have said. It's having the conversations that allow you to define the context and specificities of how transparency will show up within your organization. He attributed these principles to a lot of his success. And they would be very, very transparent, up in many cases to the edge of legality, and just sharing as much information as possible, but it can only be done with agreement. And to get to the agreement, to have the transparency requires, how much can I share with you? Are you willing to accept it? How can we have a dialogue that makes it possible?
Right. Sure, and Ariane rightly says that, of course, privacy and integrity issues play in as well. Of course. Tanja, I would say